Welcome back, everyone, to our series covering the Little Book of Economics written by Greg Ip. Today we'll be covering chapters 4 and 5. I know that's only 2 chapters, but these chapters are really important because chapter 4 covers employment, unemployment, and wages, while chapter 5 covers our favorite, inflation and deflation. So let's first look at employment. A common question people ask is where your job actually comes from. This is answered by Jean-Baptiste Say, who's a French economist arguing that there can never be too little work. His law dictates that supply creates its own demand. And we can see that on the graphic on the right. When individuals get more income, or the household gets more income, let's say, for example, a waiter earns $25 more, maybe they consume that $25 and spend it buying ice cream at a firm. That ice cream firm now has increased demand, so they'll pay their workers more, and as a result, we can see it's a continuous cycle. Clearly, supply creates its own demand. Now, we can also see this in a historical and quantitative lens. Since 1982, the number of working age Americans who want to work has grown 39%, or 43 million. In the same period of time, the number of jobs has grown an almost identical 42 million jobs. Clearly, when there's demand for certain items, supply is created. So who creates these jobs? Generally, it's small companies. Small companies have created a net 12.9 million new jobs over the past 25 years, and that accounts for 2 out of 3 every jobs added. Next, let's look at payday. So real pay after inflation depends on productivity. The more a worker produces, the more he earns. If you're more productive, or if you have better equipment, you're more likely to make more and thus get paid more. An example of this could be in the picture on the right. If a group of individuals work with a qualified team, work with a bunch of devices, they're more likely to get more things done. At the same time, if a coder is given artificial intelligence to assist them with basic coding, that also might increase their productivity. All of these actions make them more productive. But being more productive doesn't guarantee that you'll get paid more, because the bargaining power or person who's in charge of paying you is still the corporation. But increasing productivity gives you a higher chance of getting higher pay. Next, let's look at unemployment. Now, let's unravel the definition a little bit. To be unemployed, you have to be available and look for work in the 4 weeks prior. And thus, for unemployment to drop, employment must grow faster than the labor force. But in the status quo, generous welfare and unemployment insurance enables workers to take longer times looking for jobs. So, moving on to chapter 5 about inflation and deflation, which is often considered as ice and fire. So, let's first examine the harms of inflation. So, high inflation leads to social upheaval. Now, notably, most recently, we've seen this with Argentina. Because the country has seen massive inflation, a new president, a new radical president, Javier Milei, was elected. At the same time, high inflation allowed the Nazis to gain power in Germany, and communists in Russia as well. So hyperinflation, or terrible inflation, is when prices rise by 50% per month, and we see that in countries like Argentina and Venezuela. So why is inflation so destabilizing in the first place? Well, first, it confuses businesses. Inflation makes it hard to interpret price signals. If rates are rising 10%, but the cost of land is increasing by 12%, you don't really know if you want to increase the amount of land you're buying or selling. But there's also the hidden tax. Basically, inflation is a hidden tax because as wages rise to compensate for inflation, so does tax revenue. The government gets more money, and that makes it easier for the government to repay what it borrowed before inflation. So quite simply, as inflation rises, the government gets more tax revenue to pay off its debt. But at the same time, your money that you saved in the bank previously is worth less. And that robs your purchasing power, which means you can buy less in the future. Furthermore, it's really hard to get inflation down. It usually takes a recession to cure inflation, which hurts everyone. Now, we can see this specifically in the United States right now. Because the United States is trying to bring down inflation, they've increased the interest rate. That has increased the mortgage prices, and ultimately, it's harder for the United States, people in the United States, to buy houses that they want now. Ultimately, we can see on the photo on the right, that's ultimately what happens during inflation. The government sometimes benefits, but society is ultimately left with less purchasing power. Now, the common argument, or what a lot of people are asking themselves, is why does inflation actually occur? And there's two viewpoints to answer this. The first is a group of people called the monetarists, and they blame money supply. So, for example, they argue that when too much money is chasing too few goods, or basically demand outpacing supply, that increases inflation. For example, if you double the amount of money people spend on stuff, but you leave unchanged the amount of stuff, prices will double. However, this in some cases is flawed, because in order for money to cause inflation, it must be lent and spent. So even though there might be more money out there, that doesn't necessarily mean people are out there spending it. In order for people to be spending it, they have to be confident about their jobs and salaries. Now, you see on the photo on the right that there's two groups of thought arguing about why inflation is happening. And the second group of thought is the neo-Keynesians. They blame a combination of excess spending and inflationary psychology. Now, let's first unpack the excess spending, which can be summed up as demand. William Phillipson explains in the Phillips curve, there's an inverse relationship between unemployment and inflation. Quite simply, if you look on the graph on the right, when there's low unemployment, or which means a lot of people are employed and a lot of people are making money, that means they'll be more likely to spend a lot of money, which means that there'll be high inflation. At the same time, when there's high unemployment, which means a lot of people don't have jobs and they won't be spending money on luxury yachts, that also means that inflation will be low. So with this rule of thumb, it's safe to say that inflation always falls after a recession because there's lots of unemployment. Now, the second part of their theory is about psychology. They say that inflation depends on what people think. More specifically, if a union predicts that there'll be 2% inflation, they'll agree to 2% cost of living increases in their contract. And if everyone thinks that it'll be 2% inflation, inflation will settle down at 2%. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Now let's look at deflation. So this is ultimately much rarer and nastier than inflation. It's when prices are falling. And we can currently see this in China, and that's why a lot of economic forecasters are afraid about their economy's future. So there's two types of deflation. There's actually good deflation when workers and companies become more productive and the price of a certain item goes down. But what you want to avoid is bad deflation. It's when spending collapses and companies cut prices to prop up sales. And as a result, people expect falling prices and hold off on purchases. That's exactly what's happening in China right now. And after falling prices, what happens is that obviously the company needs to lay off workers because they naturally don't have as much profit. So they do layoffs and ultimately have wage reductions. Now, what's an impact of deflation? Well, the burden of debt rises, specifically for homeowners. So if you make less money now, or you might not make any money at all, but you have to pay for the very same mortgage or the very same loan, that means there's a high chance that you'll default on your debt. Ultimately, in the scenario of deflation, what happens is that prices and wages go down simultaneously. And that's a troubling aspect. So that is chapters 4 and 5 of Greg Yip's Little Book of Economics. If you have any feedback, feel free to leave it in the comments. And if you enjoyed today's video, please subscribe.